the person you love is already married. But the truth behind it will leave you speechless. Don't scroll away from this yet, because in this fictional soulmate story, the marriage is not the entire truth. In fact, if you stop at the words, "they are already married," you will misunderstand almost everything that has been happening beneath the surface. Yes, the person you love has a marriage connected to their life. Yes, there are promises, history, responsibilities, and complicated emotions involved. But what happened recently forced them to confront something they had spent a very long time hiding from themselves. And the truth behind that marriage is not simply that they are unhappy, not simply that they secretly love someone else, and definitely not some easy story where one person is good and another is bad. It is much more complicated than that. Stay here for a moment, because what they admitted last night changed the way they see their marriage, changed the way they see you, and most importantly, changed the way they see themselves. For a long time, the person you love told themselves that staying meant loyalty. They believed that if a relationship had history, if promises had been made, if families knew each other, if responsibilities had become intertwined, then leaving meant failure. So they stayed. Through uncomfortable conversations. Through periods of emotional distance. Through moments when both people knew something was wrong but neither wanted to be the first one to say it clearly. From the outside, everything looked stable enough. Photos. Family events. Ordinary routines. Maybe people even described them as a strong couple. But inside the relationship, something had changed slowly. Not one dramatic betrayal. Not one terrible night. Something quieter. The kind of distance that grows when two people stop being curious about each other and begin operating mostly through habit. They knew what time the other person woke up. They knew what food they liked. They knew who would handle which responsibility. But somewhere along the way, knowing someone's routine replaced knowing their heart. Your person felt it. Their spouse felt it too, perhaps. But both kept going because stopping to ask what it meant was terrifying. And then you entered their emotional world. Maybe you did not enter as romance. Maybe that is what makes the story more complicated. Perhaps you started as someone they simply enjoyed talking to. Someone who listened differently. Someone who asked questions they had forgotten people could ask. Not, "Did you pay that bill?" Not, "What time are you home?" But, "What do you actually want? Are you happy? When did you last do something just because you loved doing it?" Those questions stayed with them because they were questions they had stopped asking themselves. And that is where the truth became dangerous, not because you tried to destroy anything, but because your presence reminded them they still had an inner life. An emotional self. A version of themselves that wanted more than functioning. Stay with me, because this is where your person became frightened of you. Not because you were doing something wrong. Because around you, they started noticing the difference between being needed and being known. In the marriage, maybe they were needed constantly. Responsibilities. Money. Decisions. Family matters. Practical life. They had a role. A very important one. But around you, they felt seen outside the role. You noticed their humor. Their anxiety. The part of them that wanted to be silly sometimes. The part that was tired of always being dependable. The part that had dreams they had stopped mentioning because they no longer seemed practical. You listened. And listening became dangerous because it awakened a hunger they had buried. Not necessarily hunger for romance at first. Hunger for emotional recognition. They went home after conversations with you and felt guilty simply for feeling lighter. Think about that. They were not necessarily doing anything inappropriate. Yet feeling alive became something they felt guilty about because the contrast was impossible to ignore. And so they tried to pull away from you. Maybe you noticed it. 1 week they were warm. Then suddenly careful. Shorter replies. Less eye contact. More distance. You may have wondered whether you had done something wrong. The truth was that your person had started realizing how much the connection mattered, and because they were married, they became scared of what that meant. They told themselves, "This is inappropriate." They told themselves, "I need boundaries." Maybe those boundaries were necessary. But what they never said aloud was the more painful truth: stepping away from you hurt. That was when they knew something was no longer simple. They tried focusing harder on the marriage. More dinners. More effort. Maybe even a trip. They told themselves perhaps they had simply become distracted and needed to recommit. But something strange happened. Trying harder did not automatically make the emotional distance disappear. They could improve routines. They could create pleasant evenings. They could be kinder. But the deeper problem remained. They and their spouse had stopped telling each other the truth about how disconnected they felt. It had become easier to maintain the structure than confront the relationship inside it. And one night, finally, the conversation happened. Not because of you directly. That matters. Their spouse looked at them and said, "You're not here anymore." Your person immediately became defensive. "I'm sitting right here." Their spouse shook their head. "That's not what I mean." Silence. Then, "You've been gone for a long time." Those words hit harder than expected. Because maybe your soulmate had assumed they were hiding the distance well. They were not. Their spouse could feel it. They asked, "Is there someone else?" Your person froze. And in that moment, your face entered their mind. That terrified them. They could have lied. Maybe technically they could say nothing had happened. Maybe there had been no physical betrayal, no secret relationship, no explicit promise between you. But the question was not only about behavior. It was about emotional presence. Had part of their heart moved somewhere else? Maybe. And they did not know how to answer. So they said something more honest. "There is someone who made me realize I don't know who I am in this marriage anymore." Silence. Their spouse stared at them. That sentence changed everything. Notice what they did not say. They did not blame you. They did not say you caused the marriage to fail. They said your presence exposed something they had already lost contact with inside themselves. Their spouse asked, "Do you love them?" Your person did not answer immediately. Maybe because the word felt dangerous. Maybe because admitting it would make the situation feel irreversible. Finally, they said, "I care about them." Their spouse laughed sadly. "That wasn't my question." There it was. The same thing your person had been doing for months. Using smaller words because the larger word frightened them. They looked away. And then their spouse said something unexpected. Something that changed the entire direction of the conversation. "I think I knew before you did." Your person looked up. "What?" Their spouse explained that they had noticed the way your person became different whenever your name appeared. Not only happier. More present. More alive. That hurt to hear. Because it confirmed the contrast was visible from outside too. Their spouse said, "I don't think they caused this." Your person became still. That was not the accusation they expected. Instead, the spouse continued, "I think we stopped being honest with each other long before they appeared." That sentence changed the emotional atmosphere completely. Suddenly this was no longer a story about a third person destroying a marriage. It became a story about two people finally acknowledging that the marriage itself had become emotionally empty in ways neither had wanted to confront. If you enjoy this fictional soulmate-style emotional story, subscribe and stay close, because what the spouse says next is the part nobody saw coming. Instead of attacking you, they reveal a secret about the marriage that your soulmate had never told anyone. And that secret explains why they stayed long after love stopped feeling like love. The spouse sat quietly for a moment, then said, "Do you remember why we actually got married?" Your person looked confused. Of course they remembered the wedding. The date. The people. But the question sounded deeper. "What do you mean?" The spouse answered, "Not the romantic version. The real reason." Silence. And suddenly your soulmate understood exactly what they meant. The marriage had not begun only because of love. There had been pressure. Timing. Maybe family expectations. Maybe a pregnancy scare that did not result in a child but accelerated decisions. Maybe financial entanglement. Maybe one person was going through something difficult and marriage felt like security. Maybe everyone around them kept saying, "You've been together long enough. What are you waiting for?" And slowly, choosing marriage became less about an active emotional yes and more about avoiding the disruption of saying no. This was the secret. Your soulmate had once loved their spouse. That part was real. But even on the wedding day, a small voice inside them had wondered whether they were choosing the person or choosing the life that everyone expected them to choose. They buried that voice because they believed doubt before marriage meant immaturity. They told themselves commitment meant silencing questions. And for years, they tried to become the person who never asked them again. Their spouse knew. Because apparently, the spouse had felt something similar. They confessed, "I think we both got married because neither of us knew how to disappoint everyone." Your soulmate went completely silent. There it was. The truth behind the marriage. Not fraud. Not a secret criminal double life. Something painfully human. Two people who cared about each other deeply but allowed expectations, fear, familiarity, and momentum to make a decision that required more certainty than either actually possessed. Once married, the structure became even harder to question. There were anniversaries, family traditions, shared finances, mutual friends. Maybe children were not part of the story, maybe they were. If they were, the responsibilities became even more serious. Leaving would affect more than two people. So whenever one person felt unhappy, they told themselves unhappiness was normal. Whenever they felt disconnected, they blamed stress. Whenever they wondered whether they had grown in different directions, they told themselves marriage meant staying no matter what. And perhaps they confused endurance with devotion. Their spouse looked at them and said something your soulmate never expected to hear: "I don't want you staying because you feel guilty." Your person stared. "What are you saying?" The spouse replied, "I'm saying I don't know if we should keep calling fear commitment." That sentence hit like thunder. Because fear had been controlling both of them. Fear of family judgment. Fear of loneliness. Fear of starting over. Fear of admitting years may have been spent maintaining something that no longer fit. And then the spouse said something even more shocking: "I've thought about leaving too." Your soulmate froze. They had assumed they were the only one carrying doubt. "For how long?" they asked. The answer: "Longer than you know." Suddenly, the marriage they believed they were solely betraying through their emotional confusion looked completely different. Both people had been silently questioning it. Both had been pretending for the other. Each stayed partly because they assumed the other still wanted the same future. Two people trapped inside mutual protection. Your soulmate asked, "Is there someone else for you?" The spouse shook their head. "No." Then added, "But there is someone else for you." Again, "You." Your soulmate became uncomfortable. "I don't want to make this about them." The spouse nodded. "It shouldn't be." "Then, if we end, it has to be because of us. Not because you think someone else might be waiting." That was one of the most important things said all night. Because you could not become the justification for ending a marriage. Your soulmate needed to know that even if you disappeared tomorrow, they would still believe honesty about the marriage was necessary. Otherwise, you would become a rebound, an escape route, a symbol instead of a person. The spouse understood that. Your soulmate did too. They sat for a long time. No shouting now. No blame. Just grief. Because even when a relationship is wrong for the future, it can still contain love for the past. They remembered good years. Difficult years survived together. People they had become side by side. Maybe the marriage did not need to become evil to end. That was another revelation. Sometimes relationships end not because everything was fake, but because two real people changed and stopped being brave enough to admit it. Their spouse asked one question: "If that person disappeared tomorrow, would you still think something between us needs to change?" Your soulmate's heart tightened. They thought about you. Imagined you gone. Painful. But then they thought about the marriage before you entered the picture. The quiet dissatisfaction. The years of avoidance. The feeling of performing stability. Finally, they answered, yes. Their spouse nodded. Tears appeared. Not because it was cruel. Because it was the truth both had been avoiding. That answer freed you from being the cause. You were the catalyst, perhaps. A mirror. But not the origin. The problem had existed earlier. Then came another question. Do they know you're married? Your soulmate immediately said, yes. Maybe you did. Maybe you had maintained boundaries exactly because of it. Their spouse asked, have they ever asked you to leave? No. Have they pushed you? No. Have they told you they're waiting? Your soulmate paused. No, the spouse leaned back. Then don't drag them into this until we know what we're doing. That was fair. And your soulmate agreed. They needed to process the marriage with integrity before placing emotional expectations on you. So the next several days were strange. Maybe you sensed something changed. Your soulmate became quieter again, but this time it was different. They did not want to use you as emotional support while deciding whether to end a marriage. They needed to face the situation directly. But you had no way of knowing that. And because the old pattern had already made you sensitive to silence, you started wondering whether they regretted the connection. One evening, you finally messaged, "Did I do something?" Your soulmate stared at the words. They hated that their silence had made you blame yourself. They replied, "No," then stopped. Too vague. Old pattern. So they continued, "Something is happening in my marriage, and I'm trying to handle it without putting you in the middle." You read that carefully. Are you okay? Not really. You waited. Then wrote, "Do you need space?" Your soulmate almost cried. You were still offering respect instead of demanding details. Maybe. Then they added something important, "But I don't want you thinking space means I regret knowing you." Your chest tightened. That mattered. You replied, "Thank you for saying that." Then, handle what you need to handle. No declaration. No, "Choose me." No pressure. Just dignity. And your soulmate noticed. Again. That was another reason you mattered. You were not trying to win a competition. You did not want to be chosen through chaos. You wanted someone free enough and honest enough to choose you without needing another person to lose. Weeks passed. Your soulmate and their spouse began doing something they had avoided for years, talking honestly. Maybe counseling. Maybe separate conversations. They discussed finances. Living arrangements. Family. If children were involved, they focused carefully on stability. No dramatic overnight ending. Real adult consequences take time. And during one conversation, their spouse asked, "Have you talked to them?" Your soulmate answered, "A little." "Did you tell them what's happening?" "Not everything." The spouse nodded. Then said something unexpected, "When this is over, tell them the truth." Your soulmate stared. What truth? The spouse almost smiled sadly. That they didn't destroy anything. That sentence made your soulmate emotional. Because they knew you might carry guilt if the marriage ended. Maybe people would talk. Maybe outsiders would create a simple narrative: married person meets soulmate, leaves spouse. But the real story was more complicated. The spouse knew that too. They continued, "If they matter to you, don't make them carry a burden that belongs to us." That was generous. Painful. Mature. And then their spouse said one more thing. "And don't run straight into a relationship with them just because you're finally free." Your soulmate almost laughed through tears. "I know." "No, really." The spouse became serious. "Learn who you are alone first." That advice came from the last person your soulmate expected. But it was right. If the marriage ended, your soulmate needed to spend time understanding themselves outside the identity of partner, spouse, caretaker, provider. Otherwise, they might bring unprocessed grief into you and call it love. Your soulmate agreed. And that became the plan. But here is where the story takes its biggest turn. Because one night, before anything had been officially announced, before family knew, before papers or logistics were finalized, your soulmate received a message from you. A long one. You wrote, "I don't know what's happening in your marriage, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I need to be honest about something before I step back." Your soulmate's heart started racing. Step back? They opened the rest. "I care about you more than I should have allowed myself to. And because you're married, I think I need to create real distance until your situation is fully yours again." Your soulmate went completely still. You continued, "I don't want to be your secret. I don't want to become the reason you make a decision you would not make without me. And I don't want to build something in the shadow of a relationship that has not ended." Every word hurt because every word was fair. You were not rejecting them. You were refusing to build love in ambiguity. Your soulmate wanted to call immediately. Tell you everything. Tell you the spouse already knew. Tell you both people had been questioning the marriage. Tell you the truth was finally coming out. But then they stopped. Because if they told you right now just to prevent you from stepping back, would that be respecting the process, or using information to keep access to you? That question held them in place. They replied only, "I understand." You stared at that answer, perhaps disappointed by how short it was. But then another message followed, "And I respect you for saying it." Another, "I won't ask you to wait." Your chest tightened. Then. "But when my situation is fully resolved, there is something I need to tell you." You asked, "What?" Your soulmate looked at the screen for a long time. They wanted to say, "I love you." Maybe they already knew. But timing mattered. So they answered, "The truth about why my marriage really lasted as long as it did, and the part you unknowingly played in helping me finally see it." You replied, "Okay." And then you stepped back. Really stepped back. No secret late-night emotional relationship. No constant checking. No halfway intimacy. You came back because there was still one truth left hanging between them. The marriage was over. Not just emotionally, not just in one painful conversation, but fully enough that your soulmate was finally standing in a life that no longer required secrecy, half-truths, or divided loyalty. They had spent months learning how to exist alone again. They had grieved what was lost. They had stopped blaming the past for everything. They had stopped using you as an imaginary escape route. And when they finally reached out to tell you what they felt from a place of clarity instead of desperation, you interrupted them with something they never expected. Before you tell me, there's something your former spouse told me. Your soulmate froze. Their hearts started pounding because they had no idea the two of you had ever spoken. For 1 second, every old fear returned. What had been said? Had their former spouse warned you away? Had they told you some version of the marriage that made your soulmate look dishonest? Had they exposed something private? Your soulmate typed, "When did they contact you?" You replied, "After everything was officially over." That calmed one fear, but not the deeper one. Why? They asked. Your answer came slowly. Because they said there was something you refused to tell me yourself. Your soulmate stared at the screen. They already knew. A memory surfaced immediately. One decision. One promise they had made quietly during the final months of the marriage. Something they had never wanted to use as proof of love because they feared it would become emotional pressure. Stay with me, because this is where the story becomes even more powerful. The former spouse had contacted you not to destroy the connection, but to protect the truth from being misunderstood. They wrote to you, "You should know that during the last months of our marriage, they did something that surprised me." You had been nervous reading it. Then came the explanation. Your soulmate had stopped talking about you completely. Not because they stopped feeling. Because once the marriage entered serious discussions about ending, your soulmate deliberately created stronger emotional boundaries with you. They refused to make you their emotional replacement. They refused to use you as comfort after difficult conversations at home. And one night, when their spouse asked why they were suddenly creating even more distance from you despite clearly caring, your soulmate said, "Because if I leave this marriage, I need to know I would still leave if they disappeared tomorrow." That sentence had stayed with the former spouse. It mattered because it proved your soulmate was trying to separate two decisions that could easily become tangled. Ending a marriage had to be about the marriage. Loving you had to be about you. One could not be used to justify the other. Your former spouse told you that your soulmate had even said, "I don't want them carrying the guilt of thinking they broke this apart." You stared at those words for a long time when you first received them. Because during those months of silence, you had assumed something completely different. You thought perhaps your soulmate had decided the connection with you was a mistake. You thought maybe they were recommitting to the marriage and distancing from you because they no longer wanted the complication. You respected it. You stepped back. But inside, it hurt. Now you were discovering that their distance had actually been an act of restraint. Not perfect. Not necessarily the only way they could have handled it. But rooted in a desire not to pull you into a decision that belonged to them. You told your soulmate this. They said you intentionally stopped leaning on me emotionally. Your soulmate closed their eyes. Yes. You asked, "Why didn't you tell me that?" They answered exactly as the former spouse predicted. Because then the distance would have become a message. You stared at the screen. "What do you mean?" They continued, "If I told you, I'm pulling away because I love you too much to make you part of this, then I'd still be making the marriage process about us." That was the uncomfortable truth. Even noble explanations can create emotional pressure. So your soulmate had chosen silence. Was that perfect communication? No. They knew that now. But at the time, they believed it was the cleanest boundary they could create. You asked, "Did you know I thought you had stopped caring?" Your soulmate's chest tightened. "No, then, I worried you might." You replied, "I did." They whispered something to themselves before typing, "I'm sorry." You answered, "I understand why you did it now." Then after a pause, "But I wish you had found some way to tell me enough that I didn't have to invent the worst explanation." That landed. Because once again, silence had created a story. Even responsible silence still had an impact. Your soulmate replied, "I'm learning that." And they were. The marriage had taught them something painful: avoiding truth does not eliminate consequences. It just gives everyone else the responsibility of guessing. Then you told them the second thing their former spouse revealed. They said you defended me. Your soulmate went quiet. From what? You already knew they remembered. During the final months, family members and friends had begun noticing the marriage was struggling. Rumors appeared. Maybe someone had heard your name. Maybe people wanted a simple reason for a complicated ending. It is easier to blame an outsider than accept that a relationship can fail from problems inside itself. Someone said, "Is this because of that person?" Your soulmate could have remained silent. Instead, they responded firmly, "No. Do not put this on them." They refused to let people turn you into a villain. They said the marriage had problems long before you became emotionally important. They said you had never asked them to leave. Never pressured them. Never promised to wait. And according to the former spouse, your soulmate repeated that every time your name was used unfairly. You read the account with tears in your eyes because you had never known. You had spent months worrying that people might see you as the reason a marriage ended. Meanwhile, your soulmate had been privately protecting your name without telling you they were doing it. You asked now, "Why didn't you tell me that either?" Their answer was simple: "Because I didn't want basic decency to become something you owed me for." That stopped you. There it was again. They did not want to use good behavior as leverage. They did not want to say, "Look what I did for you, now choose me." They wanted the choice to remain yours. That mattered. You replied, "Your former spouse said something else." Your soulmate became nervous again. What? You wrote, "They said they knew you loved me before you ever admitted it." Your soulmate froze. They told you that? Yes. You continued. They said there was one night when you came home after seeing me and you were completely different. Your soulmate remembered. A simple day. Nothing physical. Nothing secret. Maybe a conversation. Maybe you had laughed together. Maybe you had said something honest that stayed with them. They came home quieter, but lighter. Their spouse saw it immediately. What happened? Your soulmate had said, "Nothing." Again, that word. Their spouse apparently looked at them and said, "Whatever nothing is, you haven't looked that peaceful in a long time." Your soulmate had denied everything. But the former spouse never forgot. You ask now, what happened that day? Your soulmate took a long time before answering. Then, you asked me what I wanted my life to feel like. You vaguely remembered. And? They continued, I gave you some practical answer. Work. Stability. Normal things. Pause. Then you said, no, not what you want to have. What do you want it to feel like? Your soulmate had never been asked that before. They thought about it for days. And eventually the answer became, peaceful, honest, free enough to breathe. Around you, they had glimpsed those feelings. That did not mean you were automatically the answer. But you reminded them the question existed. And once a person remembers what they want life to feel like, it becomes harder to tolerate a life that constantly feels opposite. Your soulmate wrote, that was one of the moments I knew something about you had reached me deeply. You replied, I had no idea. I know. The entire relationship between you had been full of things one person felt and the other never knew. But now, finally, those hidden moments were becoming language. If you enjoy this fictional soulmate-style emotional story, subscribe and stay close, because the next confession changes everything. Your former spouse did not only tell you what your soulmate did during the final months of the marriage. They also gave you one message your soulmate had written and never sent. Your soulmate had no idea you had seen it. You typed, there's one more thing. Their heart raced. What? You wrote, they showed me something you wrote. Your soulmate immediately knew. No, you replied, yes. Months earlier, during one of the hardest nights of the separation process, your soulmate had written a note. Not to send. Just to get the truth out of their head. Their spouse found it later with permission during the process of dividing belongings. The note began, if I ever speak to them again after this is truly over, I hope I have enough self-respect not to ask them to rescue me. Your soulmate covered their face. They had forgotten they wrote it. You continued quoting only the idea, not every word. They wrote that if they ever approached you, they wanted to come as someone who had learned to stand alone, not someone looking for another person to fill an empty place. They wanted to be able to say, I choose you, rather than, I need somewhere to go. That distinction was why they waited months. Why they did not rush toward you the moment the marriage ended. Why they learned to live alone first. You told them. When I read that, I understood why you disappeared. Your soulmate replied, I wish you had never needed to read something private to understand me. You answered, me too. But I'm glad I know now. Then they asked the question they had been holding from the beginning. Why did my former spouse tell you all this? Your answer was emotional. Because they said they didn't want me believing the worst version of you just because you were too careful to defend yourself. Your soulmate became still. Their former spouse, the person they had just separated from, had shown extraordinary generosity. Not to push you together. Not to erase pain. Simply to tell the truth. You continued, they also told me not to rush into anything with you. Your soulmate laughed softly. That sounds like them. They said you still had work to do. Also sounds like them. Then you became serious. They said if I loved you, I should make sure I wasn't rewarding you for leaving a marriage. Your soulmate nodded even though you could not see. They're right. You asked, you really think so? Yes. Pause. Ending something unhealthy doesn't automatically make me ready for something healthy. That answer made you feel safer. Your soulmate was not trying to turn the divorce into a heroic act that earned your affection. They were simply acknowledging that one chapter had ended and another could only begin if both of you chose it freely. Then came the conversation both of you had been delaying. You asked, "So what do you feel now?" Your soulmate stared at the question. No marriage. No secret. No immediate crisis. Months of solitude behind them. This was the cleanest moment they had ever had to answer. I love you. Simple. No, I think. No safer word. You stared at the message. They continued. I loved you before I knew what to do with it. I loved you while I was still trying to understand what was broken in my life. And now I love you without asking you to fix anything for me. Your eyes filled. Still, you did not immediately say it back. Your soulmate respected the silence. Eventually, you wrote, I love you too. Their entire body relaxed. But then you added, and I'm scared. They replied immediately, me too. You asked, of what? They answered, that I'll bring old habits into us. Honest. You replied, I'm scared everyone will think I was waiting for your marriage to end. Their chest tightened. I know. You continued, I'm scared you'll idealize me because I feel different from your past. They replied, that's fair. Then, I'm scared you'll leave the first time I disappoint you because you'll think I'm becoming the old version of myself. You paused. Another real fear. Two people finally putting the danger on the table before pretending love made them invincible. You asked, so what do we do? Your soulmate answered, we go slowly enough to meet each other as we actually are. That felt right. No immediate forever. No dramatic announcement. Real dates. Real conversations. Time. You agreed. The first meeting after all that distance felt almost surreal. Your soulmate saw you and did not know whether to hug you. You solved it by smiling and saying, you're overthinking again. They laughed. You noticed? Always. This time, being seen did not frighten them as much. You sat together. Talked about ordinary things first. And strangely, that ordinary part mattered most. Your soulmate had spent so long associating you with huge emotional decisions that simply laughing over something stupid felt healing. They realized you could become part of a real life, not just a dramatic turning point. At one point, you asked, do you miss them? Meaning the former spouse. Your soulmate did not lie. Sometimes. You nodded. They quickly added, not in a way that makes me want to go back. You said, I didn't ask that. They smiled. You continued, you're allowed to miss someone who shared years of your life. That generosity affected them. You were not asking them to erase history to prove love for you. Then they asked, does that make you insecure? You answered honestly, a little. Good. Truth both ways. They reached for your hand carefully and said, "Thank you for saying that instead of pretending." Small moment. Huge difference. Weeks passed. The relationship moved slowly. There were awkward moments. Your soulmate sometimes became quiet after vulnerability. But now they would say, "I'm having the urge to withdraw." You would answer, "Then stay in the room, even if you need to be quiet." Sometimes you became anxious about public perception. Your soulmate would remind you. You didn't break a marriage. Don't carry that story. Eventually, people learned you were seeing each other. Some judged. Of course. Outsiders prefer simple stories. Your soulmate did not attack them. They simply corrected the record when necessary. My marriage ended because it needed to end. This relationship began afterward. Clear. Consistent. That mattered to you. And then one day, something unexpected happened. Your former spouse asked to meet both of you. Not separately. Together. Your soulmate became nervous. You became even more nervous. Why? Was there unfinished business? A warning? Something unresolved? You considered saying no. But the former spouse sent one message: "There's something I need both of you to hear so none of us carry the wrong story into the future." That sentence changed your mind. You agreed. The meeting happened in a neutral place. Awkward beyond description. 3 people connected by a complicated history, finally sitting in the same room without secrecy. Your soulmate's former spouse looked at both of you and said, "I'm not here to give anyone permission." Then, "I'm here because there's one thing neither of you knows." Your soulmate frowned. You looked nervous. The former spouse continued, "The night we decided the marriage was truly over, I asked them one question." Your soulmate remembered the night, but not what was coming. The former spouse looked at you. "I asked whether they would still leave if you told them you never wanted to see them again." Your soulmate went completely still. They remembered now. And then the former spouse revealed their answer. Your soulmate had said, "Yes. I would still leave. Because staying would mean continuing a life I already know is dishonest." You stared at your soulmate. That answer mattered enormously. It proved the marriage did not end on the condition of receiving you afterward. Your former spouse continued, "Then I asked one more question." Your soulmate's face changed. They had forgotten this part. "I asked, and if someday you become free and they choose someone else, what will you do?" Your heart started pounding. The former spouse looked at your soulmate. "Do you remember what you said?" Silence. Then your soulmate whispered, "Yes." You asked, "What?" Your former spouse answered for them. They said, "I'll be devastated. But I'll still know ending this marriage was the right thing." That sentence silenced the table. Because it separated everything cleanly. The ending was one truth. Your love was another. Neither was a transaction. Then the former spouse smiled sadly and said, "That's why I knew you weren't the reason we ended." They looked at you. And that's why I wanted you to stop being afraid that you stole something. Tears filled your eyes. Your soulmates too. There was grief in the room, but also release. Then came the final revelation. The former spouse reached into their bag and placed something on the table. A sealed envelope. Your soulmate frowned. What is that? The answer, something you wrote before the wedding. Your soulmate's face went pale. Before the wedding? They had forgotten. Their former spouse said, I found it when I was packing. Your soulmate stared at the envelope as though it belonged to another lifetime. What does it say? You asked. The former spouse slid it toward them. I never read it. Your soulmate's hands shook as they opened it. It was a note written years earlier, the night before they got married. A message to themselves. And the first sentence made their eyes fill instantly. If I ever become so afraid of disappointing everyone that I stop listening to myself, I hope one day I find the courage to come back. Your soulmate stopped reading. Because suddenly the entire story became bigger than you, bigger than the marriage, bigger than the breakup. Years before meeting you, a younger version of themselves already knew fear might one day trap them inside a life chosen partly for other people. The former spouse had unknowingly returned that voice to them now. And when your soulmate continued reading the letter, they found one final sentence that would leave both of you speechless, because it described, years before your paths crossed, the exact kind of person they hoped would one day remind them what it felt like to live honestly.